Good morning. This is Judy Ganes, and it is with pleasure to be with you virtually today to talk about the outlook for the coffee market. And I certainly want to thank the sponsors, the hosts, for inviting me to speak with you. For those that don't know me, a little bit of my background. I have nearly 40 years covering the coffee market and cocoa, as well as other commodities as a market analyst and fundamental perspective. I'm also the co-founder of Taka Insights, which is a new platform that takes big data and synthesizes it into an easy to understand format. And it's basically taking market fundamentals and analyzing the market and putting it into a very concise format to make instant reactions on the market. And this certainly is an avenue where big data is headed, and there's a lot of discussion about the way forward in analyzing markets, and so it's nice to be at the frontier of that. As far as the market, I just want to talk to you about the fundamentals for coffee and put it into a historical context, because it's very important to understand where the market is today relative to past moves when we've been at these higher levels to make an assessment of the way forward. So last year, certainly we had a dramatic move in the market, and that continued into the early part of this year. And we've seen the Arabica market and the London Robusta market back off from those highs. Now, we're only first starting to harvest the troubled Arabica 22-23 crop. And yet the market has had a year to digest all the numbers and expectations for that crop that was hurt by drought and by 3 frosts last July. And so the market has discounted that already into the price and is starting to look forward to the next Brazilian crop, which is the 23-24 crop year, as opposed to focusing on the crop that is about to be harvested. In addition, the higher prices help to cool demand a little bit in terms of there was some switching away from higher priced Arabica to lower priced Robusta coffee. And you could see that in the spreads, and the market reacts to that. Now, we're still at relatively high levels compared to where coffee has been in the past when we've had strong moves. So I want to put the market position in a little bit more contextual framework and take the market back to, swing back a decade ago. And you can see that every time the market's been over $2, the price increase hasn't lasted indefinitely. That in fact, in 2014-15, when there was a drought in Brazil previously, the market spent very little time over $2. And so from a historical perspective, and I could even go back and look at 1997, when the market rallied to $3.18 a pound, or 1994, when we're at $2.75. Really, the maximum number of months that the market spent over $2 was 6 to 7 months. It really didn't spend, for most bull moves in coffee, an extended amount of time over $2. And the reason why is because that has given a green light signal to coffee growers to expand production, and also for some shifts in consumption. And so here we are, the market's holding over this level, and there is a down seasonal that typically occurs in the market where prices tend to rally in May, and then from June, July, August, the market comes under pressure from the Brazilian harvest. And the expectation now is a lot of talk about how the 23-24 Brazilian crop is going to have a very strong recovery. And so that's the framework that we're dealing in right now for the market. And I went to Brazil 5 times in the past year and a half and have looked at the fields and have, seen many of the coffee farms, and I've seen the production, I've spoken about it and the problems that exist. And I also had an opportunity to see the recovery in the trees since last year's frost. And so certainly there is a lot of cause to believe that the next crop, assuming the flowering is excellent, could see a strong recovery from this year's damaged crop. Now, this past week, it was very cold in Brazil. In fact, it was the coldest recorded temperatures for the month of May. There's never been a frost in Brazil in mid-May. But the damage that was done, even though it was startling to know that there was a frost last week, the actual damage that was done was exceedingly limited. Certainly, it was terrible for the farmers that might have experienced some losses. But in terms of the total production in Brazil, it was like a thimbleful in a bathtub or an ocean. It really is not going to have any material impact on the outlook for the 23-24 crop. In fact, some of you might remember that several years ago, there was another cold snap in Brazil that people thought would impact the 2021 crop. And it turns out that crop proved to be a record amount. The extent of the frost was very, very small compared to all of Brazil's production. And so it has to be kept into perspective. So there was a lot of social media noise last week and the market raced up, but the market was really correct in coming back down because the damage was very limited. Now, what is the way forward? So certainly there's a problem in terms of the 22-23 crop, and there's very, very varied estimates on what this harvest is going to be. My own personal view is that some of the estimates are overstating the crop. And then there are some estimates that are the very, very low end, and I think they're too extreme. But if we put the estimates into context and use numbers that were recently released by CONABI, the Brazilian Coffee Forecasting Agency, I want to show you the numbers here. First off, Brazil has an on-off production cycle. So you have for Arabica production. So 1 year production is higher and the next year production is lower. And that is because of the trees needing a period of rest and also farmer action, because some of the farmers will practice zero safra, meaning smaller producers will have all their production 1 year and then skeletonize, prune their trees and have no production the next year. So they always have a higher yielding crop. Now, some farmers took the decision after they had losses in 21-22 to hold off on skeletonizing their crop, hoping for recovery and some income in 22-23, and they didn't get it. Now, those farmers are going to be forced to skeletonize their trees and not have production in 23-24. And so there's a balance, because we have to understand that some of the trees that were lost from the frost last year aren't coming back into production in 24-25. And also the vegetative health started the year very, very poorly. So I think that there's some strikes against 23-24, and it's not guaranteed that it's going to be this major comeback and exceed the production of the record production of 2021. Do I think it's going to be a strong recovery? Absolutely. But can we guarantee that it's going to be a new record crop? Absolutely not. And then if you look at this and you look at the alternating years of the higher crops, what you see is that it actually took time for production to recover and then have a new high. So let's look at the jump in production in 22-23 and how many years it took for Brazil to have another spectacular record crop. We went from the year 22-23, the season 22-23, all the way until 2016-17 before we had another record crop. So you have a situation where the conditions in Brazil on most years are actually not ideal. It's very hard to have that record crop and everything go seamlessly from start to finish. And so I think it's a lot for the market to expect that Brazil is going to have this major recovery in 23-24. Well, let's talk about the 22. Let's walk back to 22-23 and point out a couple of factors here. So as an on-year crop, it is going to be the smallest in many years. So we have not had as small a crop for the on-year in about a decade. And when you look at the crop compared to last year, now the 21-22 crop was also hurt by drought. And so it was a smaller off-year crop. And we didn't have a strong recovery because we had continued drought and we also had the frost. So for the 22-23 crop, it's really more like a off-year crop size than on-year crop size. The Robusta crop is seeing continued strides and is expanding, and that's helping to buffer some of the losses in the Arabica production. Now, historically, CONAB was fairly low relative to other estimates and the USDA. But I have to say that in recent years, CONAB has been trying to make strides in their efforts to legitimize their production using satellite technology and really focusing on trying to have a number that is more credible than the market ever believed before. So when we look at the numbers in the past, you could always see that CONAB was under the USDA number. The USDA has not yet published a figure for 22-23. What I would look at as a result instead is not so much the numbers comparing USDA and CONAB, but instead look at the trends. And for both forecasting agencies, they're fairly close in what they are saying. There is an exception, and that was 3 years ago, where the CONAB number was very low compared to USDA, uncharacteristically so. But in most other years, there's fair agreement between them, at least in the net changes from one year to the next. So CONAB numbers 35 million, typically I'd say, okay, if they're 35, then USDA is going to come out somewhere of 39 to 40 million bags. That number, the USDA report, the official report comes out in the middle of June, but there's an attaché report that could be released any day now with those figures. when we're looking at Brazil, and here's just the on years in coffee production, so you could see it more clearly in terms of how small this crop is relative to the past 3 on-year crops. And there's certainly been a lot of renovation in some of the coffee areas in Brazil. And you could see that overall production was trending higher over the past decade. Even with, at times, coffee prices having been depressed, Brazil continued to expand their coffee park, plant denser, and that is helping to boost the yields per hectare. The exception and what broke that trend was in 2014-15 because of the drought, and then again for 22-23. Do I feel that Brazil is going to continue to increase production longer term and continue on this trend? Absolutely, even with higher costs of inputs and fertilization. Now, what has the impact been in terms of the supply, the flow of coffee from Brazil? So here's monthly Brazilian coffee exports for the 21-22 season, and the Brazilian crop year we measure from July to June. So we have 10 months data. And then on the Café website, which is the organization that publishes the export data from Brazil, they also release daily data. And the cumulative numbers for May show that production is also going, exports are also way down for this month. And that follows a seasonal pattern where we have Brazilian coffee shipments rising from September through December, reaching a peak, starting to level off, and then drop in the last few months. So I don't see where there's alarm on that. A lot of people are talking about, well, Brazil's hardly shipping anything right now, but it meets the seasonal pattern. And also when prices were very high and you had backlogs because of the container shortage this past year and the high freight rates, there were some delays in shipments. And that's why the March exports were really as strong as they were, because there was a lot of coffee that was held over or backlogged and came into the system. So that the pattern is really holding. You look at the November exports at how low they were. That was because of problems in the freight market and not because Brazil didn't have the supply. It was sitting in warehouse. Now, let's look at the cumulative numbers though. Okay, so if you look at what has been shipped year to date from July to April, you can see that the total for Brazil is down absolutely considerably from last year when there was the record 2021 crop available. And with high prices, there was strong incentive to export. And when I talk about high prices, I'm not only talking about the New York price, I'm talking about Brazilian, the internal price where the market is converted into the Brazilian currency. And that gave very, very strong incentive because the Brazilian currency was so weak last year. It put the market at record highs. And therefore there was every incentive for strong exports and also the green light for expanding production in the future. So even though the New York market did not see record high prices last year, the market fell short of that, barely got over 260, whereas the record highs in the market were 318. Quoted in Brazilian real, the price was incredible. So the prior record high in real, if you want to look at it here, was 500 real, okay, 1,000 real. We hit levels never seen before for the price in real. Okay, so I have it, the currency, you could quote it in either way, but the price was outstanding, and that encouraged the high volume of exports. And this chart shows how anytime you have a positive relationship with the Brazilian real, you see the export flow increasing. Okay, so going back to the slide, now we've had a back off in the supply, and the cumulative exports are still running behind the prior 2 years. So that does show the slightly smaller crop. And there was also a lot of holdover coffee from 2021. People are still debating how much coffee was really produced in Brazil in that year. Some believe it was much greater than some of the estimates that are available, and that the inventory levels, which, by the way, there hasn't been an official figure that normally is released by CONABI for March stocks. They haven't published that in 2 years. So market's running a little blind on that figure. But for right now, the market has been adequately supplied. And here we're talking about 1 year versus the next, but there's also been some issues on the demand side, okay? And with high prices and soaring retail prices in Brazil, I also believe that there was a slowdown in local demand in Brazil, and that enabled Brazil to actually have more coffee available for export than otherwise would have been. But the 22-23 crop isn't going to be enabling Brazil to see a recovery in export volumes. There's very little increase in that availability. Brazil is going to have a bigger Robusta crop. That will help somewhat, but you're not going to see a return to these very high levels from Brazil. So that means other countries are going to help, are going to be needed to help fill that gap. And that's exactly what we've seen in the past few months, where higher shipments from Honduras and Uganda and Vietnam have offset some of the reduction from Brazil. And so total exports are, on a global basis, are really not much less than they were the prior year. Now let's look at, clearly Brazil is number one, and let's look at the situation in Colombia, because that's really troubling as well. Brazil has had their problems, but you can't ignore what has happened in Colombia. During periods of La Nina, you tend to have erratic rainfall in terms of the timing of the rain, and too much rain, and it creates a small crop. And we're having a similar situation now. Every single month this year, Colombia publishes their production on a monthly basis. And in the first time in 12 years, every single month this season so far, Colombia has produced less than they did last year. And it's adding up on a cumulative basis. So the information is available October through April, and you could see how much lower the numbers are. The USDA, in their last estimate, was forecasting for the 21-22 Colombian crop to total 13.8 million bags. If we have the production for the balance of this year continue at the same course as it's been on, Colombia might not produce more than 11.1 million bags. So it'll be very similar to or not as extreme as the shortfall over a decade ago, but still very low production out of Colombia. Colombia is the second largest Arabica supplier to the market. And this tightness is being reflected in the differentials for Colombian coffee. So the differential, which is in other markets, it's called the basis, the difference between the cash market price and the New York C futures contract is the differential. And it's currently at 71 cents over for Colombia. Okay, so let me fast forward a second here. Here's Colombian exports, obviously lower because of the reduced supply. And I want to show you, I thought I included here, the differential for Colombian coffee. So just to show it to you here. What we're looking at is the differential at 71 cents over when the market is sitting over $2 per pound. That is huge. Back in 2009, when Colombia suddenly had a shock shortfall in their crop because of a combination of the too much rain, La Nina linked, and doing a rehabilitation program for the removing some of their older trees and replanting. That's why the production numbers came down so hard. We had the differential soar to $1 per pound, but the futures market was only at $1.25. So the only other time in history where Colombian differentials are as strong as they were was just over a decade ago. And at that time, the market screamed higher. It went from, suddenly the market took notice of the problems in Colombia, and the market went from $1.25 to $3.18 per pound, or just over $3 per pound, in panic over the supply situation in Colombia. And so here we have a very, very similar situation going on now. The forecasts are for La Nina to continue, at least through the next several months. And so we have to continue to watch the weather in Colombia, and what is that going to do to the main crop outlook, the harvest from October through March of next year. It is very troubling, and the market is going to have to adjust for that. So how does the market adjust for that? It either does it by the price rallying or by differentials strengthening. And so if Colombia is priced too high relative to Guatemalan coffee or Peruvian coffee, Ecuadorian coffee, whatever other origin, then buyers are going to say, what's your next best coffee? And they're going to buy up Guatemalans or Costa Ricans, okay, Peruvian coffee, and seek to make switches in their blends where possible to balance the market. So when you have a shortage in one country, it might not mean that there's a worldwide shortage. It becomes a regional shortage, and therefore the differentials react, and then the market has to allocate other coffee to meet that demand. And that is what is happening right now. So here, just skipping around the presentation, you could see how Colombian prices normally track very closely to other mild prices, and then this year surged ahead because the problems in the Colombian crop. Okay, and when you look at it, the markets are all tracking the different types of growths. These are defined by the ICO classifications: Colombian milds, other milds, Brazilian naturals, and robustas. You can see the disparity growing, and that's because of this tightness in the Colombian milds, which means then that other producers should benefit from this and ride the coattails of the problems right now in Colombia. So other mild producers will see increased demand because of the shortfall and higher prices in Colombia. Let me go back to where I was before. So again, the export numbers out of Colombia are going to be low, and that's going to demand that other countries are going to have to fill that gap. Now, last year in May, there was some protests in Colombia and blockages at the port, and that was why the May numbers were so low. And then you had Colombia make up those shortfalls later on. So let's look at some other numbers here. Honduras is an important consideration for the market as well. And you could see that the exports out of Honduras the past few months have dropped suddenly. And that also creates a potential concern for the market. Now, why is Honduras an important consideration for the New York market? And that is because Honduras is one of the few countries that delivers coffee against the New York contract. So there's many coffees that are deliverable against the New York market. Peru is, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Colombia, but you don't see those coffees coming to the board anymore. There used to be greater deliveries, but over the years that has stopped. And the reason why is because the differentials for other origins, other mild coffees, are at a premium. And you could sell your coffee at higher prices in the cash market. So why deliver it to New York at a discount? So part of that is an improvement in quality over time. And then generally the market willing to compensate producers at higher price levels than where the futures market is trading. And Honduras was the only one that had sufficient supply to depress their differential in their price to make it attractive for them to deliver coffee to the board in the past. But there isn't much Honduran coffee now being delivered either. But when Honduras has a large crop, there is precedent for them to use the market, to use the New York C contract delivery mechanism as a best buyer for their coffee, or as, I don't want to use the word dumping ground, because that's really has a sort of negative connotation, but they use the market shrewdly in terms of finding the best buyer. And sometimes that is the New York C contract and the delivery mechanism, as opposed to selling it to someone else. So if you can't find a buyer, deliver it to the board. Okay. And so when they had this big crop 2 years ago, or actually time passes by 4 years ago, that is what happened. And that coffee sat in the New York market for a long time and helped to depress prices because it was readily available. Now, let's look at the stock situation so I could show this perspective. So there's different ways to look at stocks. So when the United States stock figures are released, and they're released on the 15th of the month, what's included in that number is both the total coffee in warehouse and the portion of coffee that is certified for delivery against the New York contract. Now, years ago, and I'm dating myself, in the 1980s and the 1990s, early 1990s, you could only deliver coffee against the New York contract in certified warehouses in the United States. So it was Miami, and it was New York, and it was New Orleans. And then the exchange, which was the New York Board of Trade at the time, expanded that to include European warehouses. And as quality of coffee improved and premiums improved, there was less and less coffee that was being certified for delivery, but also less and less coffee certified for delivery that was stored in the United States, to the point where we have almost no coffee whatsoever of certified stocks in the US. It's basically held in Antwerp. And the reason for that is simple: money, the price. The price of storage in the United States is much more expensive than it is in Antwerp. And therefore, Antwerp wins the lottery, and that's where the coffee's sitting. Okay, so it's not because there's really a shortfall here. Okay, it's just dollars and cents. It didn't make it, it doesn't add up to deliver the coffee where it's more expensive. Okay, and that has to be recognized. So you could look at this picture and you could say, wow, that's really tight, but it's not. Okay, now a little bit of history. In 1997, so there was a frost in Brazil in 1994. And in 1997, supplies did become exceedingly tight. And that was also when you had just-in-time inventory practices and stocks were run down, and you had almost no certified stock. Certified stocks went below 80,000 bags. Right now, we're sitting at about 1.1 million bags, which is on the low side, and the market's going to be watching that, because as those numbers come down, the market tends to rise. So we have to watch that carefully as a potential signal of higher prices ahead. But that coffee isn't sitting in the United States, and it's not going to, because the costs involved. So when we look at United States stocks, we look at the total, and that total includes coffee from Brazil, and it includes other mild coffee, and it also includes a lot of Robusta coffee, because there's certainly a lot of Robusta coffee that's consumed in the United States. And you could see that there's a seasonal pattern where the stocks tend to build, and then they get utilized during the winter when consumption is higher in the United States during the colder months. In the past 2 years, we have not really had that seasonal build in coffee stocks. They've been relatively stable. And so even with all the exports that have come in, you haven't had this build in inventory. You have a lot of delays and problems during the pandemic. There's every incentive now to say, wait a second, because of supply disruptions, we should be holding higher inventories, not lower inventories, because just-in-time inventory practices aren't guaranteed anymore. We don't really have the same timely shipments and control as there was. And so many in different products are looking to increase inventories, and yet in the United States, we're not seeing that. So if there is a supply disruption and there is a problem, are US roasters really comfortable with the amount of coffee on hand? And I would have to argue it's sort of borderline. There isn't a big volume of coffee that is available. You need to have a certain baseline. Okay, stocks really shouldn't fall below 4 million, because then you have an extremely tight pipeline. So you need working stocks. So not all this coffee is really available, because you have to consider working stocks. So is there maybe 1 million bags extra coffee if needed to cover a shortfall? That's kind of about it. And you could see that of where the stocks were drawn down in 2010 because the problems in Colombia, and that caused the market to race to, $3 per pound. So we had the numbers released a week ago for April. And I want to show, the reason why I'm showing this is because there's also the seasonal pattern. Okay, so the market says, wow, US coffee stocks increased in April. Well, guess what? For the past decade, almost every April, stocks increased. So whenever numbers come out, you can't just look at the number and compare it to the prior year or what was the month before, because there are patterns on a monthly basis. And from my perspective, the stock increase in this past month in the US was very minimal compared to increases in the past, and very similar to what we had last year. But we should be seeing a greater increase considering the volume of coffee that was shipped out of origin. The stock number should have been higher than what it was. So that's something that I'm watching and paying attention to. So I say there's a seasonal pattern for the coffee futures market. 14 out of 15 years, this market falls June into July. But there's some red flags here that we have to pay attention to. Now, here is the example of how the stocks in New York and elsewhere have disappeared, and most of the coffee is in Antwerp and a little bit in Hamburg, but certainly those numbers have been coming down. There was a brief period for several weeks where you had an influx of coffee from Brazil when there was those heavy shipments, 2-3 months, and it created a small build in stocks. So stocks had fallen briefly under 1 million bags in total, and then went up to just over 1.1 million bags. Now is slightly below it. There was a period where there's coffee that was being graded, and that has slowed. There's almost no coffee showing up right now being graded, and I would expect to see some of these stocks again being taken and utilized. Now, let's look at this on a breakdown, and I'll explain it a little further. So here we have the huge buildup in Honduran coffee that I spoke about, and the declines from Mexico and Peru not having any coffee delivered to the board compared to what happened in the past. High differentials, no reason to deliver that coffee. What we have with Honduras is that coffee has been sitting in stock about 4 years. As coffee sits in stock, it accrues age-related penalties on an accelerated basis. So that Honduran coffee is disappearing and is being taken readily out of the market and being pulled from warehouse, because the longer it sits, the greater the discount on that coffee. And so as it gets cheaper and cheaper, it's the cheapest coffee available in the market. So if you're a commercial roaster looking to create a low-priced blend, well, why not take this Honduran coffee? And that's why this coffee is disappearing out of stock. It's not really because there's a shortfall in the market necessarily. I think this coffee would disappear from stock no matter what, because of the price, because it is so deeply discounted. And so that's why it's important to understand that sometimes there's reasons beyond just the supply and demand for movement in and out of certified stock. Okay, a lot of it has to do with financials. And when coffee is deeply discounted, it's going to move. Okay, it's very attractively priced. So that Honduran coffee, it's understandable why it has disappeared. But the Brazilian coffee that was put into stock a year ago hasn't accumulated those deep discounts. It's barely accumulated any penalty discounts, and yet it is still being utilized. And therefore, that coffee shows that there was some tightness and concern in the marketplace, and the market actually needed that coffee to cover supplies when you had this backlog in shipments. So roasters turned to the stock in Antwerp and Hamburg to take that and use what was on hand and drew down that supply. And given the expectation that the 22-23 crop isn't going to see much of a recovery, would expect to see Brazilian certified stocks continue to dwindle and disappear from the board and from the delivery mechanism. And that is going to underpin the futures market and maybe prevent it from falling as much as it otherwise would have. Another sort of final point here is the market is going to continue to be extremely sensitive to fluctuations in the dollar. Now, the dollar had strengthened tremendously, and when the dollar strengthens, it provides incentive to export coffee, not only from Brazil, but other producers. And we've seen the dollar index back off a little bit, which helps to provide some support to coffee prices. We have to also keep an eye on the dollar, and again, especially the dollar relative to the Brazilian real, to help guide the outlook for where coffee prices are going to be. Already discussed the differentials and looking at that. And so with that, I want to say thank you very much for your attention. And of course, I am available for questions that can be fed to me. And I look forward to also participating in the live discussion June 23rd.